Now, without further ado, I want to introduce Edward Krivenek. Edward is a full stack engineer whose focus mostly lies on the front end using the Angular framework. He has a nice record of building whole production applications by himself, such as portfolio assets and issue tracking systems. And as for the personal stuff, Edward is interested in science, technology, finance, and enjoys creating open source projects. Edward, floor is yours. Take it away.
Thanks for the introduction. So, hi guys, I'm gonna introduce you a new feature that was recently added in Angular version 15 called Directive Composition API. And I'm gonna tell you why it's so good and what flexibility it allows us to architect in a different way our Angular applications. I will show you a bunch of examples which you can find on my GitHub krivanek06/example projects, and the folder is Angular Composition API, or read our blog post on bit.ly.com/blog/Angular version 15 Directive Composition API. Cool. So to introduce why this composition API is so cool, we need to have a problem or a feature we want to fix. So let's say we have a template component where we have two buttons, and by clicking on each of them, we are just calling a sophisticated method that called calculation1 or calculation2 that could be like 15 or 100 lines of code doing some crazy stuff, but just for this case, we are just multiplying some value. I mean, cool. And let's say we have another component that we are looping through a list of values, and we want to reuse this calculation1 functionality inside our pipe. So as the university taught us, we will just copy this functionality and put it here, and everything works as it should. Cool. But what ends up happening that we will have a repeated code, like we will have this method here and here, and maybe another 2, 3, or multiple components directly wants to use this calculation. So we have a bunch of repeated code. And there's an old saying that I found on Wikipedia that says, don't repeat yourself. So every piece of knowledge must have a single authoritative representation within a system. Well, cool, sounds complicated. So how we might fix this problem is, well, we could abstract these two methods inside the service, but you may have lots of cases in your application that by using a parent class is much more convenient. It solves your problem better than abstracting these two functionalities into a class. So this is what we do. We introduce a parent class called calculation, and we have our component that extends the behavior of this parent class and a pipe that extends the behavior of this parent class, and everything works as it should. However, there is a little bit of problem, like right now the pipe1 class has the access of the functionality of that calculation tool. And why is this a problem? This is a problem because let's say this calculation tool can be used only on the components, or can somehow influence the behavior of this calculation one, create a HTTP request, or its computation might take like seconds to compute, right? But we want to keep both of them inside this parent abstract class, because we might have like bunch of components, pipes, where some of them use only the calculation 2, some of them only the calculation 1, and some of them both. So yeah, abstraction prevents duplicated code across your application, but you are just kind of exposing the behavior of some classes which they cannot use, or you don't want them to be used. And that's why in JavaScript we have, for example, composition. So before I tell you what is this composition API in Angular, we have to define what this composition actually means. So it has a relationship with a different class. So we might have a class called group, and it creates and has a relationship with users. We might have a factory class that has a relationship with some whatever object or class that implements the machine interface, and our factory class expects some machines to be provided in its constructor. It does not care what objects you provide, but it just cares that those objects has to implement the machine interface, and then implement the do your job uh, method because we want our machines to do their job. But it can be whatever, a car machine, washing machine, mobile machine, whatever machine, and you can then include them in your factory class. And this is useful. This is useful because you are decouple the dependency between two objects. You are including the dependency in the constructor, and the behavior of your program can change in your runtime. So you might have some like sophisticated conditional state where you might provide different machines inside this factory class based on if like what roles the user have or whatever condition is met. And also testing is much more easier because we're just mocking the dependency to some multiple classes. And this is cool and all, but I mean, we are not in the JavaScript world, we are in the Angular world, and we want to see Angular code. I mean, I hear you, I understand you. So let's take a look at some example that we have a button directive, which has an on-click method that just console log or log somewhere to some external server the user event and put an attribute to the div button element based on what you provide to it. And this directive can be used as a normal directive. You use it like daily. You just include it on the button and provide the input. But let's say your marketing team comes to you and tells you that you want to target all prime buttons that has the primary color, and you want to put this on-click functionality to all these buttons that met this criteria. But you don't want to like, copy paste this functionality to multiple places. You want to keep the code here inside this logic. And so what you might do, and you are able to do from Angular version 15, it creates a new host directive attribute inside a directive or component, doesn't matter, where you can put a list of directives. It must be a directive by which functionality you want to, let's say, inherit or extend. I'm telling inheritance in quotes because you're not creating a parent-child relationship, but you are creating a parent-child relationship with lots of parents, right? So you put the parent inside this host directive, and you right now have a reference inside your child constructor to your parent, and you might put your logic or extend the behavior of your parent class here. And I mean, this sounds so cool, and I will like quickly show you some examples, but what Angular team achieves to do is fix the ticket that has been open for 6 years where people wanted to create some multiple classes where they extend the behavior of multiple classes without creating a parent-child relationship. And when you look at the implementation of this host directive, you will see a list of inputs and outputs properties that you can provide. So let's take a look at some quick examples. And let's say you have a button directive which have a click event and a mouse event emitter, and you have a logging name and a type input property. And you want to reuse this functionality. You want to create some advanced up click login enhance directive where you reuse this functionality, but you want to expose only this mouse event emitter and this type. You don't want to expose this logging name. So you can do this in the following manner, where you provide the inputs and the outputs what you want to expose from your parent class inside your child inputs outputs host directive. And after that you can use this directive like normally like you do, and you every component that use this directive has right now access to the parent's emitter and inputs. So let's say like, for example, I haven't included this logging name inside this list of inside this list of string in the inputs attribute. However, if I want to use this host login name for this app click login enhance directive, I will get an error because it does not exist for this child. And that's so cool about composition. I will describe what inputs and outputs I want to expose from my parent class, and I can include a list of parents. So I can have a reference to 5, 10 parents and just get the functionality from the parents that I want to use. So some examples is, let's say I have an active service which has an active behavior suggest that you can toggle from true to false, and you want to extend the behavior of the ngIf structure directive. So when the active state of this service will be toggle, you want to also toggle the ngIf state from true to false. And you can use the structure directive like if activate, and let's say your component has some mocked API request, and when the data arrives, you just toggle the state. By toggling the state, this activated observable will emit a value and just change the value for this ngIf directive, and after that you will be able to see the content of these two divs. Basically, this is a very complicated way how you, for example, could solve the same problem with just having an observable and using the async pipe. But I didn't have like so much examples I could think of how you could use this host directive composition API. But this is my favorite example, is that let's say uh, there are lots of code but don't need to understand. Let's say you are creating a banner directive, and based on the text and the type you provide, you might end up with 3 different directives, some gray, green, and red, some text, and also the icon is and the color are different for each of them. But you don't always want to use the type and the text. What you might end up doing is create 2 additional directives called banner success and banner error, where you put the type on to success and error, and you only expose the text input property to your parents that you want to use. And you can use this success and error directive like in the following, and you will achieve the same results. I'm rushing through some bunch of examples, but as I mentioned previously, we have a blog post about this, and you can find all the examples in the GitHub that I included at the beginning, and it will be in the end. This is an example that you may see in lots of articles that you came across, like you have a button that has a CDK drag, tooltip, and tooltip delay, but you don't want to use always include these two attributes to some component. You only want to, for example, include only one selector and target this button by these 3 attributes. But this is not yet possible, or at least the last time, like 3 weeks ago when I tried this one, this wasn't possible. And lots of articles says this is possible, but it's not, because you are trying to use the uh, directive inside this host directive, which are not standalone components. So everything that is included inside this host directive attribute must be a standalone component, otherwise it will not work. And yeah, you will end up with an error. The last example might be that you might go really crazy, and let's say that you want to extend the behavior of the material button, include some of your custom classes, some of your custom functionalities, and then create a directive that will extend this mud button, and then just reuse this directive on some multiple directives. But once again, this will also not work because you can only use directives inside this host directive attribute, but you are trying to extend a component's behavior by a directive. So yeah, this will not work. You will end up with an error. So some restriction with this composition API, you really have to think differently when you design your components and how you want to extend the behavior, because like previously it was easy that I had a parent and I had a child. I created this relationship and I could reuse everything. But right now you can reuse some methods that you provide. You don't have to reuse everything from your parent class, and you have to think a little bit differently. So some restrictions that you have, that you can use host directive in both components and directives. Only directive decorated classes can be provided in the host directive attribute. It has to be a standalone component, and if you have a child that wants to expose some parents functionality, some parents inputs and outputs, those has to be included in the inputs and outputs list of strings. And if you want to get a reference to the parents, uh, to the parent by your child, you have to include the parent class in the host directory. Otherwise, this code will result in an error called no provider for parent found in node injector. So yeah, that was a quick run through. That was everything from me. Follow me on Instagram, LinkedIn, everywhere, and you can read our article on blog Angular version 15 Directive Composition API. And thank you for your attention.